The day of the wedding arrived, and the village was filled with joy. Obajeli, dressed in a beautiful red and gold wrapper, walked toward Ifechukwu, her heart full. She had suffered. She had fought. And now, finally, she was free. As Ifechukwu took her hand, he whispered, "Are you ready?" Obajeli smiled. Yes. And as they stood before the elders, surrounded by family and friends, she knew her journey had been long. But love had won. And this was just the beginning. The wedding ceremony between Obajeli and Ifechukwu was a grand celebration. The villagers who once doubted her now sang her praises. Drums beat loudly, women danced in colorful wrappers, and men raised their cups of palm wine in celebration. Obajeli, dressed in a stunning coral-beaded headpiece and a gold-trimmed red wrapper, felt like she was living in a dream. She had spent her life suffering. But now, she was stepping into a new life, one filled with love and dignity. As she stood beside Ifechukwu, she felt truly happy. For the first time in her life, she was not just a servant or a forgotten orphan. She was a bride. A wife. A woman loved and respected. But as the feast continued, she couldn't shake the feeling that the past was not done with her yet. That night, as the guests departed and the firelights dimmed, Obajeli and Ifechukwu sat together outside their new home. The stars above shone brightly, and the cool night breeze made the air feel fresh and peaceful. Ifechukwu reached for her hand. "How do you feel?" he asked softly. Obajeli smiled gently. "Happy. But also a little afraid." Ifechukwu's brows furrowed. "Afraid? Of what?" She sighed. "I feel like everything is too perfect. After all the pain I have been through, I'm scared it won't last." Ifechukwu squeezed her hand. "You deserve happiness, Obajeli. And I promise you, no one will take it away from you again." Obajeli leaned against him, letting his warmth chase away the shadows of her past. But in the distance, unseen eyes watched them from the darkness. And an old enemy was already plotting their downfall. Across the village, in a small, broken-down hut, Mama Chinya and Adogo sat in silence. Their days of comfort and wealth were over. No longer respected. No longer feared. They had lost everything. Mama Chinya's face was filled with anger. "That wretched girl," she muttered. "She took everything from us." Adogo, who had been silent for days, finally spoke. "It's not over, Mama," she said. "We may have lost the battle, but we can still win the war." Mama Chinya narrowed her eyes. "What do you mean?" Adogo's lips curled into a dangerous smirk. "Obajeli thinks she has escaped us," she said. "But we will make sure she never enjoys her new life." Mama Chinya nodded slowly. They would not let her win. A week after the wedding, Obajeli and Ifechukwu began their new life together. They spent their days managing Papa Ifechukwu's lands and businesses, ensuring that his wealth was used wisely. Obajeli also began planning ways to help the less fortunate in the village, especially young girls who had no one to support them. She wanted to be the person she never had growing up. But just when she thought life was settling into peace, a letter arrived at their home. It was delivered in secret, with no name attached. Obajeli opened it carefully and felt her blood run cold. Inside, written in a rough, angry script, were the words, "You may think you have won, but your happiness will not last. Soon, everything you love will be taken from you." Her hands shook as she read it again. She knew exactly who had sent it. Mama Chinya and Adogo. They were not done with her. And now she had to be ready for whatever was coming next. Obajeli sat at the wooden table, staring at the mysterious letter in her hands. Her heart pounded. The words were threatening, filled with hatred. She didn't need to guess who had sent it. Mama Chinya and Adogo. They had already tried to destroy her before. And now they were back. She shivered as fear crawled around her heart. Would she ever truly escape them? Just then, Ifechukwu walked in and saw her pale face. "What's wrong?" he asked, concern in his voice. Obajeli wordlessly handed him the letter. His face darkened as he read it. His hands tightened into fists. "They dare threaten you," he said, his voice filled with rage. Obajeli swallowed hard. "I knew they wouldn't let go so easily." Ifechukwu stood up. "I need to put an end to this." She grabbed his arm. "What are you going to do?" He exhaled sharply, trying to control his anger. "I will speak to the village elders. Mama Chinya and Adogo will not get away with this." But Obajeli felt uneasy. Would the elders really help? Or would Mama Chinya and Adogo find another way to strike again? That night, as darkness covered Umwagu, Mama Chinya and Adogo sat in a small hut on the outskirts of the village. They were not alone. A strange man sat before them, his face hidden by the flickering light of the oil lamp. "Are you sure you can do this?" Mama Chinya asked. The man chuckled, his voice cold and sharp. "I have done worse things," he said. "What do you want me to do?" Adogo's eyes gleamed with hatred. "Obajeli must pay for what she has done," she whispered. "We don't just want to hurt her." She leaned forward, her voice deadly. "We want to destroy her." The man smiled, a cruel, dangerous smile. "It will be done." Obajeli had trouble sleeping. The letter still haunted her. She kept replaying Choma's attack, the poison attempt, and now this threat. She turned to see Ifechukwu sleeping peacefully beside her. She envied his calmness. Just then, a noise outside made her sit up. She held her breath. Another sound, a rustling in the bushes. Someone was outside. Her hands trembled as she reached for a lantern. Carefully, she slipped out of bed and moved toward the door. When she stepped outside, she saw a shadow moving near the fence. She gasped. "Who's there?" she whispered. The shadow froze. Then, without warning, it disappeared into the darkness. Obajeli's heart pounded violently. Someone was watching them. And whatever was coming next was far more dangerous than she had imagined. Obajeli stood frozen, staring at the dark corner where the shadow had disappeared. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Someone had been watching them. But who? Her mind screamed the answer, Mama Chinya and Adogo. They had sent the letter. And now they were ready to strike. She clutched her wrapper tightly and turned back to the house. She needed to wake Ifechukwu. As soon as Obajeli stepped inside, Ifechukwu stirred. He rubbed his eyes sleepily. "Obajeli. What's wrong?" She hesitated. Should she tell him? Would he think she was imagining things? But the memory of the dark figure outside made her shiver. "I think someone was outside," she whispered. Ifechukwu immediately sat up. His face darkened. "Did you see them?" Obajeli nodded slowly. "A shadow, but when I called out, they ran." Ifechukwu gritted his teeth. This has gone too far. He grabbed his machete from the corner and headed for the door. "I'm going to check." Obajeli grabbed his arm. "No. It's dangerous." He looked into her eyes. "I won't let anyone harm you," he said firmly. Then he stepped into the night. Ifechukwu moved stealthily, his machete gripped tightly. His eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement. The moonlight cast long shadows across the compound. Then a soft rustling near the trees. He turned sharply. "Who's there?" he called. Then a twig snapped. He rushed forward, heart pounding. But when he reached the spot, no one was there. Just the sound of the wind through the trees. He exhaled sharply, gripping the machete tighter. Whoever it was, they were gone. For now. The next morning, Obajeli woke up feeling uneasy. She hadn't slept well after Ifechukwu's search. He had returned, saying he found nothing. But she could see the anger in his eyes. Someone was watching them. And Ifechukwu would not let it continue. Later that day, Ifechukwu went to see the village elders. He stood before them, his voice steady but angry. "Someone is threatening my wife," he declared. and I won't stand for it. The elders murmured among themselves. Motsi Okoro, the oldest among them, spoke first. What proof do you have, Ifechukwu? Ifechukwu placed the letter on the table. Motsi Okoro picked it up, reading slowly. His brows furrowed. This is serious. Ifechukwu nodded firmly. I want permission to investigate. If anyone is found guilty, they must face punishment. The elders nodded in agreement. Very well, Motsi Okoro said. But be careful. Evil hides in many forms. Ifechukwu thanked them and left. But as he walked home, he couldn't shake the feeling that this battle was far from over. As Obajeli prepared dinner, she heard a knock at the door. She hesitated. Who could it be? She wiped her hands and opened the door. Her blood ran cold. Standing there was Adogo. Dressed in a simple wrapper, her face calm, but her eyes filled with something dangerous. What do you want? Obajeli asked, her voice steady. Adogo smirked. I came to talk. Obajeli crossed her arms. There is nothing left to say. Adogo stepped forward slightly. You think you have won, don't you? She whispered. Obajeli stayed silent. Adogo chuckled darkly. My mother and I. We are not finished with you. Obajeli felt her fingers curl into fists. Leave my home, she said. Adogo leaned in closer. This is just the beginning, Obajeli, she whispered. Then, with a slow, cruel smile, she turned and walked away, leaving behind only a trail of fear in the air. When Ifechukwu returned home, Obajeli told him everything. His face darkened with rage. That's it, he said. This ends now. Obajeli looked at him nervously. What are you going to do? He gritted his teeth. I'm going to confront them. Obajeli reached for his hand. Ifechukwu, be careful. He looked at her, his expression fierce. I will not let them harm you, Obajeli. They will regret this. As he stepped out, heading toward Mama Chinya's hut, one thing was clear, this war was just getting started. Ifechukwu stormed toward Mama Chinya's hut, his fist clenched. He had tolerated enough. The threats. The whispers. The attempts to destroy Obajeli. Tonight, it ended. As he reached the small, worn-out hut, he saw a dim light flickering inside. Voices whispered. He didn't knock. He kicked the door open. Inside, Mama Chinya and Adogo sat huddled, speaking in low tones. They jumped up in shock as Ifechukwu entered. Adogo's face twisted in anger. How dare you come here, she hissed. Ifechukwu's voice was deadly calm. I dare because I've had enough of your games. Mama Chinya crossed her arms. We don't know what you're talking about. Ifechukwu threw the threatening letter onto the table. This. Their faces stiffened. This is your handwriting, Mama Chinya, he said coldly. Silence. Then Mama Chinya laughed. It was a low, mocking sound. And what if it is, she asked. Ifechukwu took a step forward. If anything happens to Obajeli, anything at all, I swear, you will regret it. Mama Chinya's smirk faltered. But Adogo stepped closer, her eyes burning with hate. You think you can threaten us, she sneered. Ifechukwu didn't blink. This is not a threat, he said. It is a promise. He turned to leave, but before he stepped out, he looked back one last time. If you ever come near my wife again, you will wish you hadn't. Then, without another word, he left, leaving behind a stunned silence. The moment Ifechukwu was gone, Adogo turned to her mother. What do we do now? She asked. Mama Chinya's eyes gleamed with fury. He thinks he can scare me, she spat. Her hands tightened into fists. This is not over. Adogo smiled darkly. Then let's make her suffer. And just like that, a new plan was born. One that would strike where it hurt the most. Back at home, Obajeli waited anxiously for Ifechukwu to return. When he stepped inside, she rushed to him. "What happened?" she asked. Ifechukwu let out a deep breath. "They didn't deny it," he said. "But I warned them. If they try anything again, they will regret it." Obajeli nodded slowly. But deep inside, she knew. Mama Chinya and Adogo were not the type to back down easily. Something told her this fight was far from over. The next morning, just as the village was waking up, a terrible scream echoed through the air. People rushed outside to see what was happening. Obajeli and Ifechukwu ran toward the noise. And then they froze. Lying on the ground, shaking violently, was a young girl from the village. Her skin was covered in strange rashes. Her eyes rolled back in her head. "She was poisoned," someone shouted. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Then, a woman pointed straight at Obajeli. "She ate food from Obajeli's house last night." Obajeli's heart stopped. The crowd turned to her with suspicion. And just like that, the whispers began. "She poisoned the girl. Maybe she really is cursed. I knew she wasn't as innocent as she looked." Obajeli's blood turned cold. This was exactly what Mama Chinya wanted. And now, she was the target once again. The whispers in Umwogu village grew louder. People pointed at Obajeli, their eyes filled with suspicion. "She poisoned the girl," someone muttered. "Maybe she was using charms to trap Ifechukwu," another added. Obajeli felt her stomach drop. This was exactly what Mama Chinya and Adogo wanted. And now, the village was turning against her. The girl who had fallen sick, little Amarochi, was still trembling on the ground. Her mother, Neka, wailed loudly. "My child. My only child." She turned furiously to Obajeli. "You did this," she cried. "You poisoned my daughter." Obajeli's heart pounded. "No. I would never do such a thing," she said quickly. But Neka wasn't listening. "You gave her food from your house last night." Gasps filled the air. Even some of the elders looked uneasy. Ifechukwu stepped forward, his voice firm. "My wife is innocent." But Motsi Okoro, the head elder, raised a hand. "This is a serious matter, Ifechukwu," he said. "Until we know the truth, we must follow tradition." "What tradition?" Ifechukwu asked. The elder's face hardened. Obajeli must stand trial before the village council. Obajeli felt weak. A trial. This was worse than she thought. Later that evening, Obajeli sat in their hut, shaking. Ifechukwu paced the room, his anger barely controlled. "This is madness," he muttered. Obajeli's voice was shaky. "What if they find me guilty?" Ifechukwu knelt beside her. "They won't," he said firmly. "Because you are innocent." Obajeli bit her lip. "But what if they don't believe me?" Ifechukwu's jaw tightened. "Then I will fight for you." His eyes burned with determination. "I won't let them take you." Obajeli felt tears in her eyes. But she knew, this battle was only beginning. The next day, the entire village gathered at the village square. The elders sat on wooden stools, their faces serious. Obajeli stood before them, her hands trembling. Mama Chinya and Adogo watched from the crowd, smiling secretly. Their plan was working. Motsi Okoro cleared his throat. "Obajeli, you stand accused of poisoning Amarachi," he said. "What do you have to say for yourself?" Obajeli lifted her chin. "I am innocent," she said firmly. Mamas ran through the crowd. "Lies," Neko spat. "My child ate from your house, and now she is dying." Tears filled Obajeli's eyes. She had no proof to defend herself. She had no way to convince them. Unless. She suddenly thought of something. "The food I gave Amarachi," she said. "There was still some left in my house." The elders exchanged glances. "If the food was poisoned," she continued, "then testing it will prove my innocence." The crowd fell silent. This was a risk. If the food showed no poison, she would be free. But if it did, she would be banished or worse. Motsi Okoro nodded. Then let us test it. And so, the fate of Obajeli's future rested on one final proof. The village square was silent as everyone waited for the elders to test the food. Obajeli stood still, her heart racing. If the food was poisoned, her fate was sealed. She could be banished, beaten, or worse. Mama Chinya and Adogo watched from the crowd, their eyes filled with cruel delight. They were sure that their plan had worked. But Obajeli refused to give up hope. She knew the truth. And she prayed that today the truth would save her. Motsi Okoro, the head elder, stood up. Bring the food, he commanded. 2 young men hurried into Obajeli's house and returned with the remaining food. It was placed before the elders. Motsi Okoro turned to a respected herbalist, Dibia Omenka. You will test it, he said. The old man nodded and stepped forward. He scooped a small portion of the food and examined it closely. Then he took a special leaf from his bag and placed it inside the food. The village held its breath. If the leaf turned black, the food was poisoned. If it remained green, Obajeli was innocent. Seconds passed. Then minutes. Everyone watched the leaf. Slowly, it remained green. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The food is not poisoned, someone shouted. Obajeli let out a deep breath, her knees weak. She was innocent. Ifechukwu grabbed her hand, his face full of relief. But Motsi Okoro was not satisfied. If the food was not poisoned, he said slowly, then who poisoned the girl? Silence. Then, suddenly, Dibia Omenka stepped forward. I have an answer, he said. All eyes turned to him. I examined Amarochi again this morning, he continued. She was not poisoned with food. Gasps filled the air. Then how? One elder asked. The herbalist's eyes darkened. She was poisoned by something placed in her bathwater. A heavy silence fell. Everyone turned to Neka, Amarochi's mother. Who gave her a bath before she fell sick? Motsi Okoro asked. Neka frowned, thinking. Then, suddenly, her face turned pale. She pointed across the crowd. It was Adogo, she cried. Gasps of shock and disbelief spread through the crowd. Obajeli turned sharply to see Adogo's face frozen in horror. Mama Chinya grabbed her daughter's arm. She's lying, she shouted. My daughter would never, I saw her. Neka interrupted. Adogo came to my house the morning before Amarochi fell sick. She offered to help me bathe her. All eyes turned to Adogo. Her face twisted with panic. I don't know what she's talking about, she stammered. But the elders were not fools. Motsi Okoro's face hardened. If what Neka says is true, then Adogo has committed a great crime. The villagers murmured angrily. They had almost punished an innocent woman because of Adogo's lies. Motsi Okoro's voice boomed. Adogo, do you deny it? Adogo's breath came in short gasps. She looked around, searching for an escape. Then, suddenly, she turned and ran. The villagers shouted and chased after her. But Ifechukwu was faster. He grabbed her arm before she could escape. Adogo screamed and struggled. Let me go, she shrieked. But Ifechukwu's grip was strong. You will face justice, he said coldly. The elder stepped forward. Adogo, for trying to frame Obajeli and harm an innocent child, you will be punished. Mama Chinya fell to the ground, wailing. Please. She is my only child. But the elders were unmoved. Take them both away, Motsi Okoro commanded. And with that, Adogo and Mama Chinya were dragged out of the village. Never to return. That evening, as the sun set over Umwogu, Obajeli and Ifechukwu sat together in silence. For the first time in a long time, there were no shadows left in their lives. No more threats. No more fears. Just peace. Obajeli turned to Ifechukwu. I never thought I would be free of them, she whispered. Ifechukwu squeezed her hand. You were always meant for greater things, he said. Obajeli smiled. She had suffered. She had fought. And now, finally, she was truly free. With Mama Chinya and Adogo banished from the village, Umogu slowly returned to normal. The tension that had once clouded the air was gone. People who had once doubted Obajeli now respected her. She is a strong woman, the elders said. She survived everything and still stands tall, the women whispered. For the first time in years, Obajeli felt safe. She no longer had to look over her shoulder. No more threats. No more fear. Just peace. And with that peace came new beginnings.
Enjoyed the tale? If so, please like the video, comment, share it with your family and friends, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell for more enchanting tales like this one. Goodbye.